Welcome everyone to our Bible study on this August 15th, which is St. Mary's Day here at St. Matthew's Church in Glendale, California. Glad to have you joining us for Bible study wherever you are and whenever you're able to watch. We're going back to Mark chapter 6 today, so you can open up in your Bibles to Mark chapter 6, and in just a moment we'll be starting at 6 verse 45. Chapter 6 of Mark in verse 45. Does anybody remember what we were just reading about?
The feeding of the 5,000.
The feeding of the 5,000. We'd gone past John the Baptist, John the Baptizer, and now we had just heard the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And so it's the wrap up of that that launches us into verse 45. And why don't we start down on my screen with Pam, verse 45, please.
Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd.
Now, as is often the case, and if you have a map in the back of your Bible, you can look. Sometimes there's multiple places with the same name. You think about that, it seems a little odd to us, but there are many towns with the same name, right? Same thing happened back then. So they've gone from one Bethsaida, now they're heading over to another Bethsaida, which is kind of on the eastern side. And they're going from the eastern side to the western side. So now they're going to the western side after he sends the people away. Now, Mark doesn't really tell us why Jesus sends the people away. If you remember a little bit of our discussion, you might have picked up on it last week. Or if you can think the fuller story as John tells it, put your thinking caps on of what more John tells us. Why does Jesus send the crowds away?
I'll guess because he was tired.
Well, that's in there.
Quiet time.
He needs quiet time. That's there. And we're going to get to that in the next verse. But there's a bigger reason also. But Mark doesn't tell us. What was the reaction of the crowd to the feeding of the 5,000 that John really fleshes out more?
They wanted to make him king.
They wanted to make him king, right. Mark doesn't go into that in depth here, but John tells us that. So Jesus is sending the crowds away. Why?
So they won't make him king.
And what's the potential, what's the risk going on at this moment?
Romans.
Troops.
You've got this huge crowd of 5,000 potentially plus people who all now of a sudden want to anoint somebody king. That's called a insurrection, a revolution, a rebellion. This is dangerous right now.
Like we had January 6th.
There's a comparison. So now you can see that they're sending the people. He sends the people away. He puts the disciples in a boat, and then 46 tells us what he does himself. Scott, please.
And after bidding them farewell, he departed to the mountain to pray.
And in John, it almost sounds like he kind of disappears off to the mountain. They don't know where he's gone. But the way Mark tells it is he puts the disciples in the boat. He tells the crowd, you got to disperse, go home. What's the old line? You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. All right.
Yeah.
He sends the crowd away. He sends the crowd away, puts the disciples in the boat, sends them out to the sea. And now he goes up on the mountainside to pray. And the word which is used for prayer here is a fervent prayer, a pouring your heart into prayer, being totally connected to God in this deep, deep sense of prayer, an emotional prayer. You can imagine he's physically exhausted, he's emotionally exhausted, he's mentally exhausted, he's spiritually drained. And now think of another aspect. Thinking of what John has told us about what's happening here, there's another way that Jesus is being exhausted here. Let's think for a moment. So the crowd wants to, as we heard, wants to make him king. Try to connect back to the earlier part of Jesus' ministry and think if that reminds you of anything. The launch of Jesus' ministry. We typically think of what as launching Jesus' ministry?
Turning the water into wine.
Yeah.
That's his first miracle. Even prior to that,
When he's baptized.
the baptism. What happens after the baptism?
The dove descends and
the word from above.
A voice from above, the dove descends, and then
The
Jesus.
declaration.
Here's the voice. Then what does Jesus do?
Goes into the wilderness.
It says the Spirit drives him out into the wilderness where
tempted.
By the devil.
he's tempted by the devil. Well, think of the temptations. The temptations, one of them is to become king. Bow down and worship me, and I'll give you all of these kingdoms. So in the midst of everything else Jesus is dealing with here, the physical exhaustion, the mental exhaustion, the spiritual exhaustion, he's also now under fierce temptation. Here's the crowd willing to do what the devil had said he would do, just hand him the kingdom on a platter. Jesus has all this weighing upon him as he goes off into this moment of fervent prayer that he needs to be alone and just regroup himself.
And think of a retreat,
Very
where
much.
you have to restore and renew.
Very good comparison.
And distinguishing the divine from the human, the latter has to be a matter of reevaluating what this message and what this mission is.
He's constantly, his natures are working together, and somehow he's dealing with that temptation just like we would. What is this? Yeah. The Episcopal Church used to use a newspaper ad, which some people didn't like, but it was a picture of Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I can't remember the caption, but it was something like, Jesus was tempted, how could you think you weren't, or something, or that you wouldn't be. And of course he was. He was totally tempted just like we are in the garden at this moment throughout his whole life, which launches with, of course, the temptation in the wilderness. Gladys, would you read 47, please?
When it was evening, the boat was at the midst of the sea, and he was alone on the land.
So the word there for evening is the second or the late evening, which would be about 6 p.m. Sun is setting, and he's off there alone. Now, John had told us he goes off to pray, but Mark kind of is the only one who puts it quite this way, that now the disciples are out there and Jesus is all alone, Mark tells us. Diane, 48, please.
They saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. About the fourth watch of the night, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them.
So the disciples are distressed in their rowing. They're straining at the oars. Any other translations for that verb of the oaring?
Laboring.
Laboring. I should say
Toiling.
the adverb of it.
Struggling hard.
Struggling hard. The word literally means to be tortured or to be tormented. It's a word which can be used for slaves under heavy toil, for criminals who have been put on what we might call a chain gang today, which of course would have been slave galley ships in that day. It's a word of driving a ship or driving a chariot. They're doing it with their oars. Just the other day, I was watching some old episodes of Nova on PBS, and it was an episode on the Vikings and the Viking raids coming from Scandinavia into England and how they settled and conquered and all of that. But as part of this episode, it's Nova, so it's a science show, so they've always got to do some sort of experiment. And so they build a Viking ship, and they sail it into England, and they go down the river as the Vikings would have. We think of the Vikings conquering the coast, attacking the coast, but how they were so successful in taking England for a time was they got into the rivers, and they were able to go right up and raid every town along the river. Yeah. So they built this Viking ship, and they're rowing up the river, and they're showing people's reaction on the banks. These guys are all in traditional Viking costume in this Viking ship sailing up the river there in England. And you see people on the bank kind of waving, looking at what's going on. But there's a part in their rowing where they hit, this is exactly what happens to them. This calls it to mind. So they're just against the winds, and these guys in this boat are just, they're just working as hard as they can. And you know how far they're moving? They're basically staying in the same place. Yes, they're working as hard as they can. They're not moving. That's the image here. The disciples are just doing everything they can against these winds, and they're never getting anywhere. And then about the fourth watch of the night, which is between 3 and 6 a.m., with these winds against them in this horrible gale, he comes walking to them on the lake. and he was about to pass by them. Mark is the only one who says it's like, it's not like we picture it as Jesus walks to the boat, but the way Mark tells it is he was walking past him. He was just out there walking on the lake. He was going to go right past him. Mark's the only one who mentions it that way. Verse 49, are we at, is it Diane or Dennis?
Dennis.
Dennis.
When they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out.
Well, you're not quite used to seeing somebody in the middle of a storm come walking to you on the lake. You can imagine, especially in a more, I mean, I think probably today, a lot of people would wonder if it was a ghost. And ghosts don't exist, of course. But back then, in a superstitious era, they were just terrified. And the word for cried out, does anybody have something besides cried out?
Screaming.
Screaming.
Screamed in terror.
Okay.
That spoke to them.
Oh, interesting. It's the word here is, it's a shriek of terror. Think of that, think of when you're horribly surprised, that shriek of terror. That's what comes out of their mouths as this is horrible fright. Verse 50, Adam, please.
Because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid."
And you can imagine, you might think, well, why didn't they just realize? Well, it's dark. They just see this image. They can't make out who it is. They see this apparition almost walking past them out on the water. They shriek in terror, and his response is, "Take courage, it is I," the Greek ego eimi, which we typically translate I am. It's also the Greek transliteration for Yahweh, the name of God. Not that it's always used that way, but here it seems to have a little bit of an echo of that. It's I, do not be afraid. They can't recognize him by sight. How do they recognize him?
His voice.
His voice. In the midst of this terror, it's his calming voice that says, "Don't be afraid." And verse 51, Jean, please.
Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded.
Utterly astounded. What other translations do you have for that?
Completely confused. Completely amazed.
Completely amazed, completely confused. Those are good.
Utterly and completely dumbfounded.
Utterly and completely dumbfounded. That really fleshes it out. Okay.
I have when the winds calm down.
Okay. The winds died down, or the winds calmed down, and he gets into the boat, and they're just like, this is not something you expect every day. They're just in complete shock and awe, as we might say today. Verse 52, Melissa, please.
For they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened.
Now that's kind of odd. They didn't understand about the loaves. What Mark is telling us there is they had just seen this great miracle, Jesus demonstrating his power. And of course, John tells us more that Jesus says, this is the sign. It's not Moses who gave you the bread in the wilderness. My Father gave you the bread in the wilderness. And here I am, and I am the bread of life. They haven't caught this message. They still don't understand who he is because their hearts are
Hardened.
Or closed.
Closed. We often associate that with the Pharaoh story, with the Exodus story, but it's just a word of your heart just isn't open. You just can't get this. What isn't here in the story? When you hear this story, what's the other part you typically think of that happened?
You're walking on the water.
Jesus is walking.
Well, then Peter says.
Did Peter walk on the water?
Peter walked on the water, right? And what happened when Peter walked on the water?
Yeah.
Oh, ye of little faith.
Peter starts to sink in when he realizes he's out on the water, and Jesus catches him, and Peter. That's not in Mark's gospel. Why do you think Mark doesn't tell us that? Bless you. Not to say we can know for sure, but let's try to put our thinking caps on here. Why maybe did Mark not tell us that part of the story?
Maybe it's a distraction. It's not the important part of the story.
Oh, it's
Peter
possible.
didn't tell him.
Ah, Dalton, yes. Mark is writing the Gospel of Peter, we say. These are Peter's memories. Now, it could have been that Peter did tell him, and Mark thought, ooh, I'm not going to include that and embarrass Peter. Or it could just be the way that Peter told the story. He was really ashamed of what had happened, and so Peter doesn't tell the story that way. But it's interesting that Mark doesn't give us that detail here of Mark doesn't put Peter on the spot, we might say. Verse 53, Daniel, Mr. Acolyte, 53, please.
They crossed it over the lake and landed at
Gennesaret.
Gennesaret. There they tied up the boat.
Good. Thank you, Daniel. So now that's actually just a few miles. So they've basically fought the storm all night, and they only made a few miles ahead. They only made a few miles down the lake. They haven't gotten very far. And so they aren't very far from where they just were. And so 54, Sandra.
As soon as they got out of the boat, the people recognized Jesus.
Well, he didn't get very much rest there, did he? He didn't get away from the crowds for very long because he just had that little break. The disciples go out in the boat that night. They only get a couple miles, and so the crowd hasn't gone very far. You can imagine 5,000 people are dispersing in different directions. Probably a lot of them went this way, and they're like, there he is again. And the response in 55, Carol?
It ran through that whole region round about and began to carry about in beds those that were sick, where they heard he was.
And now this is continuing action, very vivid language. It's people, think of it running. They're just running everywhere they can, and they're bringing all the sick that they can on their mats. That reminds us of what story?
One where they let him down through the roof.
Same language there. They're bringing people on their pallets, their litters, their, what do you call it in the military? Why can't I think of the word? Stretcher? The litter. They're bringing him all when they hear where he is. So just as they're trying to get some rest, just as he needs rest, now everybody's flooding back towards him. Mike 56, please.
And wherever he went, to village or town or farm, they laid down the sick in the open spaces, begging him to let them touch even the fringe of his cloak. And all those who touched him were cured.
Beg there. Do you have other words for that verb other than beg?
Besought.
Besought. This is deep pleading. The people are bringing out everybody they can think of. Everyone is wanting to get there, to be around him. And we've heard just now how exhausted he is, how much he is drained, and now everyone is coming to him needing healing. And you can imagine the toll that's going to take. We're going to stop there at this point, at the end of chapter 6, and not launch into chapter 7, even though we've got about 10 minutes left, and that's because I'd like to have some discussion time today. But I'm going to sign out our Bible study group, so brief lesson today, but we'll see you next week, starting with Mark chapter 7.